how all those soldiers who went to fight the war in Korea at that time. Yeah, so that was a time when a lot of American soldiers, a lot of British soldiers were in South Korea, and they got captive, and then they were, brainwashed, so-called, in quotes, and changed their minds. Anyway, and it was sort of hinting, or really trying to say that religion is really just, it's all a form of brainwashing. It just depends how you were brought up and so forth. So I can remember thinking, well, I was raised in a Christian home, and so obviously my parents were very influential in my faith. And then I started thinking about that, so have I been brainwashed and that kind of idea? And I have to confess that somebody at that time actually just gave me some advice. He said, look, you'll get a lot of questions as you go along in the Christian life. So what I recommend you do is have a kind of in tray, and you just stick the questions in your in tray and think about them and read about them. And gradually they will be resolved. But don't let all those questions in the in tray just sort of, disturb your daily Christian life. There's no point in that, because you're always going to have some questions. And so I kept that question in my in tray for a while. I did quite a lot of reading. I came across a wonderful writer called Donald Mackay, the late Donald Mackay, who is one of the most influential thinkers in the area of science religion, certainly in this country, and more broadly in the latter half of the 20th century. And anyway, it was quickly, it was resolved pretty soon, actually. But I just mentioned that as one kind of example that came across my thinking and my desk, as it were, at that time.
Great. Could those who have just joined us please mute themselves to avoid any background noise? Thank you. Jeff, how would you address that question?
Well, I became a Christian when I was 12. Now, my parents were not Christians, so I was kind of raised in an agnostic home. But I never really perceived, as I said in my 3-minute piece, any profound conflict between science and faith. I do think the recurring issue that many of us deal with, that I think unfortunately is misunderstood by some in the Christian community, as well as sort of new atheists, is not really a scientific issue, it's a metaphysical issue. It's what Donald Mackay called nothing buttery. Maybe other people have called it that too. Dennis uses that phrase, and so do I, is kind of the absurd metaphysical overreach in the name of science. And that, it gets tiresome at times to deal with that, but it just seems like that's misunderstood by some who are in maybe the atheist community on the one hand, and then there's pushback, but over the wrong sorts of things by many in the church. And I think so that affects me. I don't think I've ever been personally troubled. I don't think the foundations of my faith have ever been shaken by a particular scientific finding. And I think that's one thing that's refreshing about this event, actually, is there are a lot of people here who maybe have similar backstories.
Well, I think also, just thinking of Donald Mackay, I think he was so smart and insightful in clearly distinguishing between, I guess, what we call now methodological approaches to science and ontological approaches, in the sense that, he would distinguish between ontological reductionism and methodological reductionism, which is, a bit of a mouthful, but really making clear that what we do in the sciences all the time is a form of methodological reductionism. If you want to find out how something works, you take it to bits, and then hopefully you put it back together again. And of course, that's what we do in the biological sciences really all the time, and indeed in many of the other sciences. But Donald Mackay was fond of pointing out, sort of more formally, to follow up on Jeff's point about nothing buttery, that ontological reductionism is something really quite different. And that claims that when you take something to bits, then you've really explained all there is to explain. You've said everything you can about that particular phenomena or that particular organism. If it's a living organism, you've got the bits, and so that's all there is. So that's nothing buttery. You're just saying it's nothing but all those bits. And forgetting, of course, that you need to put the bits together to really see how they all operate as a system and what their meaning is as a total system. Mm-hmm. So it's worth underlining that, maybe.
I think the other thing I would say is that Dennis actually said this, and this has been true for me too, is that many of the problems come when you insist on a completely airtight articulation between your theological and biblical ideas, if you're a Christian, in my case, and your scientific ideas. And I think what Dennis and I are saying is we need to hold both loosely. There's theorizing in both areas. And when we try to seek, an absolute jigsaw puzzle-like fit between those two realms of reality, that's, I think, when we are going to be tending to head for some heartache in certain ways. So I'm content not to try to overpress that case.
Yes, I do remember as a very young Christian, became a Christian at university when I was 21. But I remember as a young believer that people would press me about evolution and genetics. And it was one of those areas, and my faith as well. So how does evolution and faith come together? And of course, we know that that's one of the big contentious issues that carries on to this day. But I couldn't, for some time, reconcile the two. And then I, as Jeff said, came to that point of realization that, and I don't mean to be cliched when I say this, but there is a certain amount of mystery to our faith. And perhaps some of that is not everything being revealed to us so clearly, even in our profession here on earth. When I'm talking about genetics, when I'm talking about evolution, perhaps it isn't meant to fit together. And if you do hold it loosely together, if you hold it loosely, then that allows room for both. But as I've gone on in my career, I've actually, and as I've examined, the structure and function of chromosomes and the genome, I actually see more of a fit than I did when I was a younger Christian.
I think it's interesting also that, we've all got different backgrounds in different countries and all that sort of thing. And that influences the science faith discussion quite a bit, I think. And I often think about this, that I, was raised, as I mentioned earlier, as a Christian, and also very early on got fascinated and engaged with the biological sciences. But it never occurred to me at all that evolution was anything like a sort of issue or topic of discussion for Christians. That wasn't in my environment. I was brought up in a pretty conservative Christian home in some ways, but, my mother was a physiologist. I mean, it simply wasn't, it didn't cross our minds, actually. Creation evolution would be some kind of a discussion topic. Why would it be? You couldn't imagine that, okay? And really it was not until my late 20s, I think, when I was living overseas, that I met somebody for whom this obviously was quite an issue. And then I was really quite surprised. And then I suddenly realized that, there are different views and different backgrounds of different people around the world. And that's good for one's cultural orientation. So I often think that the issues that we just thinking collectively here, might have in our minds about the science and faith discussion are very influenced, aren't they, by our families, our background, the country we're brought up in, what language we speak. And if you go to some other, if you go to some African countries, as we do when we give our Faraday Institute courses, you just find the set of issues just very different, so different sets of issues entirely. I just think that's good to remember in this discussion.
Absolutely. It wasn't until I came to live in the US that I encountered issues, and the evolution one was also, even evolution versus creation really exploded over here. But there were other issues here that I encountered that I didn't in the in the UK when I lived there. So that cultural exposure is very significant in this discussion. So Jeff, what are your thoughts on that? Have you experienced, this sort of controversy?
Well, I've often said that I grew up near the Washington, D.C. area in the U.S., but in terms of my intellectual gestalt, I'm more comfortable in many ways with the UK on these topics. Maybe that was because I was partially preconditioned by St. Clive, as C.S. Lewis, as a high schooler and an undergraduate. But one of the interesting and refreshing things about doing some things with the Faraday Institute and some other things outside of the continental US is that you realize that the triangulation is really different, and that's incredibly helpful, I think, to remember that. Yeah, so the other thing I would say about this whole kind of challenge issue is there are technological challenges that we are facing as a society based on our human ability to manipulate ourselves that are new, that were maybe sci-fi topics in the past. Well, now in the 21st century, science fiction is becoming science reality, at least to a small extent. I think if you come back for Dennis's discussion about are we slaves to our genes, he does a really good job of dealing with that towards the end of his book by the same name. And so I think for Christians, we're going to need to have some sort of readout and think carefully about these issues, understanding the science and not just being sort of Luddite perhaps about this, but on the other hand, thinking in profoundly Christian ways. And that's where we maybe don't realize how much we're shaped by our ambience, and those of us who are scientists we're in a situation on a day-to-day basis where, we talk about a certain subset of things and maybe don't think as broadly as we need to about the appropriateness of manipulation of ourselves and the human species and those kinds of things. So there's some profound issues on the horizon for sure.
Yeah, I would certainly absolutely agree with that. And I think this is quite a challenge for the church community in general to have to be a little bit finely tuned about responses to those different issues. So on one hand, I think it's really important that the church is seen as positive about science, as we've been, of course, thinking during this conference, positive about technology, giving thanks to God for all the gifts and wonderful things that technology does for us. And I guess being in the middle of a pandemic, really is quite easy to do that in many ways, isn't it? To give thanks for vaccines and give thanks for these wonderful discoveries that immunologists have been so good at over the past year and in our present time. So in the same breath, though, we also, as Jeff is, I think, rightly saying, we just need to be so aware of some of the things creeping along there that can suddenly pounce upon us, where I think the general public really has a hard time right now in keeping up. And, how can we blame people about the difficulty of keeping up with the rapid advance of technology and the advances of science, especially in brain control, some things like that, which are quite striking at the moment, and AI and what that does in terms of its ability to, the potential ability to both enable people, let's say, who are paralyzed from the neck down, and maybe now gives them the ability to just blink their eyelid and move a cursor on the screen that enables them to do things and moves their arms, which were previously immobile, and so forth. We could just cite many, many amazing advances in technology. And yet, I think it always seems to be the case that in the biological sciences and in the other sciences, they're always justified, quite rightly so, for good medical applications. That's how science is done. That's how it gets funded, isn't it? But then, of course, the very same applications that are so powerful for the good can also have potential for evil sometimes, and for really powerful methods of human manipulation. So I think one of the challenges we have now, those of us who are Christians, is to think about, how do we get that right? What's the balance? And that's really a big challenge. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I was actually reading a question here, and since I've got it, I'll pose it to the both of you. And it reads this. It says, if creation is a source of revelation, this makes science a crucial ally of the church. How else can we unpack the text? Yet creation texts are rarely preached from the pulpit, apart from being merely illustrative. Why is this? Full disclosure, over the past 10 years, I've preached on geophysics, DNA repair mechanisms, neural stress, reducing mechanics, catalysts, immune systems, vaccines, etc. And I continue to wonder why churches aren't more fully engaging God's first book. Do either of you want to take that one on?
I'm looking at Jeff.
Jeff, go for it.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes, I mean, I think that's right. You know, the old kind of distinction between general revelation and special revelation, we can kind of, I don't want to overuse those terms, but many of us might be familiar with those. Those are both revelatory. And so I think one of the things that I was trying to do in my little 3-minute piece by quoting Psalm 19 is that the beginning of that psalm, it's a nature psalm, the beginning. And, you know, it's interesting that the regularities of the heavenly bodies, which the ancients knew very well, those regularities, are a source of praise to the Creator for his faithfulness and reliability. And then, of course, it moves on to talk about the law of the Lord in the second portion of the psalm. And then, you know, at the end, both of those sources of revelation lead the psalmist to think about himself in the sense that, you know, he asks, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight. So both of those things somehow are impinging upon him in his relationship with God. And so probably it is true that I think, at least in the American church traditions that I've been a part of, we don't really go after the particularities of that first kind of revelation enough from the pulpit. Now, having said that, that's really hard for the average pastor or preacher to do that. So if you're you know, Christine is a kind of a minister scientist, and, you know, she can do that from the pulpit, but, and, you know, I have a bit of training in that regard myself, but you know, many of us on this Zoom call who are scientists maybe don't have theological training, and conversely, the average pastor has very little scientific training. So, so what do we need there? Oh, I think we need people who are popularizers, who get the basic gist of the science right, but make it sufficiently accessible that someone can appreciate it. You know, the kind of maddening thing to me is most of the best popularizers have a strong take, and it's not a theistic take. You know, Richard Dawkins he's an easy target here, but, you know, when he does science writing, he's fantastic, but then he can't help himself, right? Then he kind of goes off the rails or gets out of his lane, and then that's frustrating. So to me, somehow, I guess I'm praying that we would have some popularizers who'd be willing to step into that space. Dennis has done some of that, and I appreciate that very much. But we need more of that. And that goes all the way down to preschool level. So, you know, the Faraday Institute has produced a series of books for children of different ages, and those are delightful. And we need those kinds of things that get the science right at an age-appropriate level, but then fuse that with an opportunity for worship of the Creator in my case, from a Christian view.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was also going to request that I have the name of the person who asked that question so we can invite them to preach in our church. Okay, so it sounds great that somebody would be preaching so much of science and faith from the pulpit. But I would just want to back up also Jeff's point here that I think there are, you know, some preachers and people who have the right theological qualifications, but they don't always have the right science background. And so, you know, it can be occasionally, I've sat there I won't mention this, of course, in my own church, not my, but in other places, you know, where you've been listening to a sermon and the person started talking about science and it's been a little bit embarrassing. And so the scientists there in the congregation are kind of cringing a little bit, you know, hoping that the preacher might move on to something a bit different. So it's a tough challenge there to get it right, I think. I was going to just mention also here in the UK, we have something called the Boyle Lectures every year. They were founded indeed by the estate of Robert Boyle, and they went for many decades. In fact, after his lifetime, well into the 18th century. And then they died out for quite a while, but then they were revived again 20, 30 years ago. And so we have an annual Boyle Lecture, which is a lecture about natural theology, usually from the pulpit of St. Mary Le Bow, which is an old church right in the heart of the city of London. Last week, we had a great lecture from Professor Tom McLeish, who's a Christian and a physicist. He's now professor of natural philosophy at York University. And Tom only took up that chair on the condition that it would be called the chair of natural philosophy, because he's very keen to underline the fact that his physics is part of a wider domain of constructed knowledge, which we call natural theology. And of course, if you come back a couple of centuries here in Cambridge, we didn't really have scientists, we had natural philosophers and so on, and that's a whole other history there. But I think that's a good reminder also, isn't it, that traditionally in this country, in the UK, certainly, if you wanted to learn about physics, what we now call physics in the 17th century, it's quite likely you would learn it from an Anglican church pulpit. That's where you might learn it from, okay? And so it's a good reminder that the church was very much seen as, you know, the spokes, the organization where you hear about science, where you learn about science. And then, of course, it was really through, well, until 1871, all the lecturers, professors of science and all the other subjects here in the University of Cambridge had to be ordained clergymen. Okay, so Darwin learned all his science from ordained clergymen, Anglican clergymen, while he was here. I think that history gives us a little bit of a reminder of the way that science and faith have really grown up together.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So I'm looking at a question from Daniel Cayley. This is a great question. In your view, could a Christian scholar theologian who's not a scientist be a popularizer in their preaching? My answer would be absolutely yes. And so I think that's why the Biologos Foundation and the DOSER, the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in the US, and then the Faraday Institute and other programs in the UK have programs to try to help scientists interface with clergy. And there are programs that move in one or the other direction, from the church outward to scientists who maybe have trouble understanding the church, or from scientists towards the clergy. I think those programs are crucial, because there's a great temptation to kind of shade your presentation for some sort of polemic or apologetic use. And I think sometimes scientists who know the science in some area, and it sounds like Dennis has had that experience, you can be frustrated by the way the science is presented. I think someone who I think is a good exemplar here is Daniel Harrell, who's now the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today magazine, but was at Park Street Church in the Boston area, and then in Minnesota as a senior pastor. And I think Daniel's a great example of someone who has listened to the scientists in his congregation. So the way that I think a pastor can be an effective popularizer is to lean on the people who know the details. And so when that happens, then I think that the popularizing can be really great. And as Dennis said, that tradition goes back a long ways, especially in the UK and continental Europe.
And I think also one of the key things that all preachers can have, and church leaders, is to preach clearly about hermeneutics, not necessarily as a sort of technical, theological lesson from the pulpit, which might send a few people to sleep, but you want to, by the way they handle the text, they can teach hermeneutics. In other words, how do you understand this text? What kind of literature is it? Reminding their congregations, there are more than 20 forms of literature in the Bible, and that if you really want to understand what God is saying to you through the Bible, then you better get a hold, first of all, of what kind of literature do we have here? Is it poetry? Is it apocalyptic writing? Is it, is it a theological essay like Genesis chapter 1, and so forth and so on? And I think that can be very helpful, give a very good grounding to the young people in the church. So when they end up doing science in university, they're able to see that, no, the Bible is not a scientific textbook. It's intended to teach us different kinds of things. And that can be of great help, I think, in helping them to engage with the sciences they then go to study.
Yeah, I think that answers a question that was just posed here about, this was addressed to Dennis. What I appreciate about your books is really what, sorry, apologize. What I appreciate about your books is that they really dig into what the Bible words mean in the big picture to link those to science. Do you want to elaborate on that? Kind of ties into what you were saying, Dennis, I think.
Well, I could go on for a few hours, but I don't think we have a few hours here at the moment. So, okay, but yes, I think that is a key, isn't it? And really just grappling with what the text said in its own context with a historical background. And obviously, the ancient Near East writings, again, are going to be a great helpful, gives helpful insights into the early chapters of Genesis, for example. I think the writings of John Walton here are great, and I would thoroughly recommend those to really help us to engage with the A&E kind of background, cultural background of those texts and so forth. And I think, and getting to texts so that we understand them to other texts of the scripture, I think that's such a key as well. And there's such a danger for all of us, I think, and I've been guilty of this, I'm sure, of picking, verses out of the context and putting them up on a sort of pedestal, but not really relating them to other, to the passages both in the Old and New Testament. And I think simply coming back to creation, I think one of the problems about teaching creation is people think that it's all about Genesis 1 to 3. It's not, it's about the whole Bible. And, all the biblical texts, the whole Bible is about God's wonderful creation, almost on every page, exaggerating slightly here. And I think when you come to the New Testament also, there's such a lot of key teaching there. And it's a Trinitarian creation. And it's a creation where God is immanent in the created order. And you get so much about the immanence, that is to say, the involved God, that through Christ all things exist, and so forth. And John 1 and Colossians 1 and Hebrews 1, any New Testament, book that has the first chapter, somehow you've got in there some passage, wonderful passage about this involvement of Christ in upholding and sustaining the created order, so that all things are made through the word of God, John chapter 1. So I think that if that powerful theology comes through from the pulpit, I think that's such a help for us all.
So I have, thank you for that answer, Dennis. I have a question from a master's student who says, I am in a master's program in religion and science at Boyle Lectures University. My undergraduate degree is in education. Without a science undergrad, what opportunities are there for me to teach, be used by God to help people bridge the gap between religion and science? I have a heart for university students, especially at ASU.
Yeah, that's one for Jeff, clearly.
There you go, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dennis. Well, actually, a couple of my old seminary professors are at Biola Talbot. J.P. Moreland is there, and Scott Ray, who's a bioethicist now. I used to make runs to photocopy journal articles about Hebrew hermeneutics for Scott when I was a seminary student. So I think this gets back to the issue of, can one learn enough science to be valuable in the ministry space? And I would say absolutely yes. But as I said before, I think it is also crucial to not feel like you have to know everything. I most certainly don't know everything. And I think the older you get, the more you realize that is the case. And we in the Christian church really ought to lean hard into Ephesians 4, that God has given the church different kinds of people for the building up of the body into the head, who is Christ. And we all contribute. So, you know, in the U.S., it's true that in campus ministry and we kind of have missionary exemplars, especially older guys like me. The exemplars were the lone missionary that would go off someplace. And Eric Little was mentioned in one of the 3-minute testimonies this morning. And he's a good example of that, going off to China by himself. And God may call you to do that kind of thing. But I think we in the US, because we're highly individualistic, we tend to underappreciate the communal aspects of being members of Christ's body. So in that sense, probably the most important thing, if that's what you feel God has laid on your heart, is to find a community of people who can help you think well about science and who you can push back on to think better about the Bible and about theology and about classical Christian faith. So I think that flow ought to go in both directions. We do have a tendency in the US, at least, to think of the kind of the priesthood of science in a way, like only scientists know the science well enough to talk about it, and you can't do that because you don't know enough. And I really want us to resist that as the church. I think it may be true that you don't have the depth of knowledge of an expert, but that's true in any area. It's not just science. But I think we do tend to single science out as somewhat unique in that way. And I would want to push against that particular notion. Now, having said that, then, you know, there is a notion, I'm a Protestant, so we have the notion of the priesthood of all believers, and strong one coming down to us mainly from the Reformation, perhaps. And so in that sense, scientists who are Christians have a special responsibility to try to help people like you. So anyway, it's my prayer that you would find those kinds of people. And you know, Biola Talbot is great on certain things. You know, apologetics is well known for, I think. That will help you think well and keenly. But you know, I think finding scientists who really know their stuff is an important assist there, if this is what you want to do.
Yeah, that's great. And also, it's worth underlining, isn't it? We've been thinking a little bit about missionaries there, and as Jeff mentioned, the word was raised in a couple of the 3-minute kind of introductions that were given earlier on. And I always just think it's good to emphasize that every Christian is a missionary in the New Testament way of thinking about that. So every Christian is sent out by God to be salt and light and share their faith in the world, wherever God places them. And just to give you one example, I was called to go and help out in helping to develop new university departments in Turkey way back in the 1970s. And so there we found ourselves doing that job in the university as a scientist. And then we saw, yeah, well, in this city of Ankara, there's no church, not a single one. The capital city of the country, not a single church. In fact, there weren't any Christians either. So in fact, we knew of one, just to be precise, in the whole capital city. So what are we supposed to do? Here you are, you're a scientist, and you're a Christian living in a city and it hasn't got a church. Well, you better start one. Okay, that's what you're supposed to do. So now that's what we did. And so, you know, I just give that as a little illustration. It depends where God places you around the world in what the need is. Now, if you're going to another city and it's got about 100 churches, and there are probably too many of them anyway because they don't work together as they should, etc., you don't want to start another one probably. So you have a different mission. You have a mission to be salt and light in the community where God has placed you. So I just want to underline that, I think. And I think that's important for Christians to think about that when they're students or they're doing a master's, just to think about how can I be salt and light in the place where God wants me to be.
I think that's an excellent point that you make, Dennis, because I remember some years back driving into work one day, and this was going into my lab, and just thinking, you know, I've been in this career a long time, you know, and I've often gone back and forth about do I want to work in a secular ministry versus a Christian ministry? And it's just that discussion that percolates in your head, you know. And as I was driving to work, there's this freeway or motorway that goes into downtown Phoenix, and you go through these little mountains, and it's just an absolute beautiful sight, and you see down into the valley, you see the whole city. And as I was driving, I just had this revelation that, well, I was in the place that God wanted me to be, because as a working in clinical work in leukemia and lymphoma, there were few people who were doing my actual specialty, and even less, fewer people who were Christians in that field. And so I was placed there to be that witness for God. And after that, and even before that, this happened, people would come to my office and say things like, well, I hear that you believe in the Bible, you know, how do you deal with this? Or I have a spiritual issue, can I talk to you? And that to me was really an affirmation, I suppose, that my faith was being expressed in my work in a way such as my colleagues were seeing me. And so I agree, be involved in the community that you happen to be in that moment of time. So as a graduate student, you've got students around yourself, engage in those students. And the more you do of that, the more confidence you will have, and the more light you'll have in following your direction in your career. So if you have any questions, please shoot them our way. We have about 5 minutes left before we have to end this session. We've had great questions so far. So please go ahead and put in any questions. And if not, what I'd like to do is to give both Jeff and Dennis a couple of minutes to just summarize some of your thoughts or ideas or comments that you've mentioned here that you think are probably takeaways. I know I put you on the spot about that. And in the meantime, if any questions come through, we'll ask them after that. Jeff, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, you know, in my 3-minute piece, I talked about the fact that for me, doing good science is an act of worship. And I do want to come back to that. I think people like Dennis, Christine, and I think a lot about how to interface with our colleagues, both Christian and non-Christian. And I think one of the ways that we can interface with our colleagues who are not people of faith is this notion of wonder as we study the biological world. And I think for me, this is a way that I can move towards something that goes beyond the science with my non-Christian colleagues. And you know, let me just, I was poking fun at C.S. Lewis earlier, but he has a great quote from his book Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. He says this: any patch of sunlight in a wood will show you something about the sun which you could never get from reading books on astronomy. These pure and spontaneous pleasures are patches of godlight in the woods of our experience. And of course, the end of this paragraph is his famous phrase, joy is the serious business of heaven. And I think Christians ought to be as excited about what they're learning about God's world. In fact, they should be more excited about that than people who are not people of Christian faith. And so I think I'm wanting to not ever forget that. You know, you can get kind of caught in the drudgery of the day-to-day and writing grant proposals and trying to get papers out, and you know, a piece of equipment just broke, or gosh, how many undergraduates are going to ask me what's going to be on the quiz this week? If I lose that sense of wonder about the gift of God's creation, then I'm not being faithful. And so I think that's the one thing I'd leave you with.
Okay. Dennis.
Great. Well, I would certainly say amen to everything that Jeff has said. Okay.
Yes.
Point number one. And certainly I would see the laboratory, I'm retired out of active research now, but always see the laboratory as a sacred space. You know, people think they're going to the secular world when they go into their laboratory. I say, no, they're not. They're going to a sacred space. This is where you're going to discover more, hopefully, about God's wonderful creation and begin to understand it more clearly. But I want to just pick up a little bit on what we were discussing earlier on. This is sort of broadening out the whole discussion on science and religion, science and faith and so on. We were thinking about complementarity and so forth. And I always think it's a challenge for those of us who are Christians and who are scientists, and generally, you know, any Christian really thinking about these things. I think it's always a challenge to get a balance between what I want to call integration and complementarity. So what do I mean by that? Well, I guess in integration, you're really trying to integrate your science and your faith very tightly together. And of course, the challenge there is you don't want to bring theological language into the laboratory specifically. That's not going to be very helpful when you're understanding human embryology, or, you know, you want to use your technical language correctly, you want to use the scientific language properly, otherwise no one will know what you're talking about. Okay, so you've got to get that right. Then of course you go to complementarity. Complementarity is saying, well, there are many ways of knowing. You walk around your university campus and there are different faculties and departments, and each one has its own particular way of justifying its beliefs and thinking about how to do science, how to do its own particular subject. So these are complementary ways of knowing. We need them all. Of course, the danger in that direction is they become too isolated from each other. The different disciplines never talk to each other. Theology never talks to science. So I'm just saying, I think just that's a challenge I still find, you know, well, how to relate that, you know, how to do that in such a way that it brings glory to God and justice to all the different things that we're doing in our daily lives. I think I heard a tingling, which probably means our time is up.
Yes, it does. Well, that leaves me to thank you, Dennis, and you, Jeff, for your contributions and for this excellent conversation that we've had. Thank you, all of our attendees, for joining us. And we look forward to having you in the next session, if you're joining us. And on that note, I shall close this session. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
James, good to sort of see you.
Thank you so much.